Snow fell like whispers that had waited 100 years to be heard. It softened the edge of every fence post, turned the world white and slow. The prairie beyond the barn lay hushed, save for the crunch of tiny boots sinking into the drift. A girl no taller than a fence rail walked ahead, her hand tied around the hem of her cream blouse, the other pulling her little wool scarf tighter against the wind. Her cheeks were raw from cold. Her eyes, too old for 6. She paused at the heavy door of the cabin and raised a trembling fist. 3 small knocks, then silence. She waited. Inside, Silas Boone stirred from his chair. 35 winters had taught him not to answer quick. He stood slowly, thick coat already hanging by the stove. When he opened the door, steam from his coffee curled between them like breath from a beast. The girl looked up. "Sir," her voice was dry. "My mamma's too weak to walk." Silas's brow furrowed, but she had already stepped aside. Beyond her, near the edge of the frozen path, lay a figure half buried in snow. A woman, her dress torn at the hem, soaked with red and melting frost. A long black braid, tangled and trailing behind her like ink across paper. Silas didn't ask questions. He moved. He hoisted her into his arms, light as a sack of feathers, and carried her past the cabin, into the barn, where the fire still slept cold in the hearth. The horses stirred in their stalls as he laid her gently onto a bed of straw. The girl followed, standing beside her mother, like a shadow that refused to leave. Silas knelt, checking for breath. Shallow, but there. He touched the woman's wrist. Fever burned through her skin. Her lips were chapped, her face too pale beneath the dirt. Blood soaked the back of her dress. "Been out long?" he asked without looking up. The girl nodded. "Since last night." He reached for a lantern, lighting it with steady hands. In the golden glow, he saw more. Embroidered neckline, beads missing, one moccasin gone. She wasn't from around here. Not from town. But he'd seen her once long ago at the general store, head low under the stares of women who made a life of whispering. He remembered the name they gave her. Redbird. They never used her first. The girl sat close, knees drawn to her chest. Her eyes wandered the barn, wooden beams, frost on the walls, a pitchfork leaning like an old judge against the stall. "What's your name?" Silas asked, voice rough. "Elsie. Elsie, you hungry?" She nodded, but said nothing more. He handed her a thick wool blanket from the corner, the same one he used when his nights were too cold for sleep. She wrapped it around her shoulders and scooted nearer to her mother. Mira Redbird moaned once in her fever dream, then fell quiet again. A gust of wind howled through a crack in the boards, shaking loose snow from the rafters. One of the horses shifted, snorted into the cold. Silas moved quickly now, started a fire in the stove, filled a pot with water, and tore strips from an old flour sack for rags. The blood was too much for a fall. He could see the way her belly rose beneath the fabric, tense, round, not from hunger. His heart thudded. She was in labor. He crouched beside her, unsure again. "She's early," he muttered. "She was trying to walk to the mission house," Elsie said suddenly. "They turned us away." Of course they had. The town barely held room for widows, much less a native woman carrying a mystery child. Silas had heard the way they talked at the saloon, how men acted righteous with whiskey on their breath. Mira cried out, her back arching. Silas dropped to his knees, catching her as she twisted. Her eyes opened just long enough to see him. "Don't let them take her." "They won't," he said, surprising himself. Snow swirled beyond the barn door. Inside, the heat grew thick. Myra's hands clawed at the straw, pain biting through her. Silas spoke low, calm, like he did when foals were breached. "You're gonna be all right," he told her, again and again, not knowing if she heard. "You just keep breathing. That's all you gotta do." Hours passed like this, fire flickering, breath clouding, the girl silent as stone. And then, when it seemed the night could stretch no longer, a cry broke through the barn. Sharp, small hole. Silas held the newborn in his arms, blood still wet on his sleeves, hands shaking as he wrapped the pale blanket tight around the baby's frame. A girl. Mira collapsed back onto the straw, tears leaking from the corners of her closed eyes. Elsie inched forward, touching the baby's foot with one finger. "She's real small," she whispered. "She's strong," Silas answered. The lantern flickered above them, casting shadows like ghosts across the beams. A hush fell again, deep, sacred, as though the barn had remembered it was also a church. Silas looked at Mira, her face drawn, lips parted, still breathing. Then at the child in his arms. Then at Elsie, sitting in silence beside the only home she had now. He didn't say a word. But slowly he stood, walked to the stall, and opened the gate. The two horses turned toward him, their breath rising in the cold like steam from ancient wells. He placed the baby into Myra's arms, adjusting the straw beneath her, brushing her braid gently to one side. And then he did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He closed the barn doors behind him and locked them from the inside. Morning broke slow and pale, casting long beams of amber light through the slats in the barn wall. The frost hadn't lifted. The fire had dwindled to coals. Myra stirred first. Her body ached in places she didn't recognize. She blinked up at the rafters, the warmth of something pressed against her chest. The baby. Her baby. She looked around, dizzy. The smell of hay, horses, smoke. Her braid clung to her damp skin. Her dress still carried blood. She shifted slightly, and pain curled through her side. A soft sound, Elsie, asleep beside her, clutching a folded coat like it held the world. Then him. Silas Boone stood near the stall, scooping oats into a trough. His face unreadable under the shadow of his hat, sleeves rolled, boots dusted white with frost. He glanced at her just once, then looked away. "You're still here," she said, voice ragged. He didn't answer right away. The only reply was the rustle of horses chewing, the low creak of old wood. "You tried to leave," he said finally. Her breath caught. He had noticed. Of course he had. "I thought maybe you only meant to help for the night. I didn't carry you into this barn to let the snow finish the job in the morning." She sat up too fast. The baby stirred and fussed. Myra winced, biting her lip. Her strength hadn't come back. She wasn't sure if it would. "I can't pay you," she said. "I can't give you anything for what you've done." Silas wiped his hands on a rag. He walked to the stove, poured broth from the pot into a tin cup, and brought it to her. When she reached out, her fingers shook. He didn't steady them, but he didn't look away either. "You don't owe me," he said, "but you're not leaving in this weather." Elsie opened her eyes, rubbing them. "Mama," she whispered, "did we stay too long?" Myra looked down. Her heart sank like a stone through water. "No, baby. We're just resting a little longer." Silas moved to the barn doors. He opened them halfway to let the smoke out. Snow was still falling. Light drifted in, casting a soft glow over the straw. But beyond the quiet, the world was stirring. Hooves approached. Voices. 2 men on horseback crested the hill from town, Sheriff Mason and Pastor Calhoun. Silas stepped outside, his silhouette tall against the white. "Boone," the sheriff called. "We heard you've got company." Silas didn't answer. Calhoun pulled up beside him, eyes sharp beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "There's talk a woman and her child were seen heading this way. You wouldn't be hiding anyone, would you?" Silas stared at them both. "They were near dead when I found them." The sheriff frowned. "That's not the question." Calhoun leaned closer. "You know how this town sees her kind. This ain't about weather. It's about what's right in the Lord's eyes. Bringing that woman into your barn, some folks think it's unclean." Silas's jaw tightened. "Unclean's letting a mother die in the snow." The sheriff looked past him. "You're inviting trouble, Boone." "Then I guess I'll serve coffee to it when it knocks." There was silence, thick as old molasses. Calhoun sneered. "You always were too soft for your own good." Then the horses turned, and the men rode off, the sound of their departure lost quickly in the snowfall. Inside, Myra had heard it all. She sat frozen, the cup cooling in her hand. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Silas returned without a word. He stirred the fire, poured more water into the kettle. Myra finally looked at him. "They'll come back," she said. "I know. They'll make it harder for you. I know that too." She watched him move, how carefully he handled things, how quiet his hands were. There was something inside him that had nothing to do with pity. It was steadier than that. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He didn't answer. So she lay back, holding her baby, and stared up at the ceiling where morning light dappled across the old pine. That night, when the fire was low and the wind began to wail again, Myra crept from a straw and wrapped her baby tight. She kissed Elsie's forehead and bundled her shawl around her shoulders. They made it as far as the pasture fence before she collapsed. Her legs gave out, body folding into the snow like a broken wing. Silas found her by lantern light. The child, bundled in Myra's arms, was still breathing. Mira herself was barely conscious. "You don't get to decide what I can bear," he muttered, lifting her again. She tried to speak. He hushed her, carrying her back into the barn. Her braid brushed against his coat, dark as river silt. "I'm not trying to save you," he said, laying her gently back down in the straw. "I'm just not letting go." He sat beside her through the night, one hand resting near hers but not touching. The fire glowed orange, and snow crept softly beneath the door. In the morning, it was Elsie who opened her eyes first. She crawled over, leaned against Silas's arm, and whispered, "Is this where we live now?" Silas didn't look away from the fire. He reached over and picked up a piece of the baby's blanket that had slipped away. He tucked it gently beneath Myra's chin and murmured, "If you want." The barn stood silent around them, wrapped in winter and wood smoke and the weight of a promise. Outside, the town would talk. But inside, something else had already begun to grow.